Today's Justice Matters video is part 2 of a 3-part series involving an extended conversation I had with law professor and military law expert Dan Maurer. Yesterday, we discussed how Donald Trump is directing the military to unlawfully kill Venezuelans in international waters. And today, we take on the topic of how the military leadership is scrutinizing social media posts of soldiers, of military members in the aftermath of the murder of Charlie Kirk. It's important to keep in mind that military members retain their First Amendment free speech rights with some limited qualifications. But, based on recent reporting, it's beginning to look like the military leadership might be using social media posts as a pretext to punish military members for saying things that might displease Donald Trump or Pete Hegseth. So friends, I hope you enjoy part 2 of this extended conversation with law professor Dan Maurer. I think people right now are probably keenly interested in what's going on in the aftermath of the murder of Charlie Kirk. And it looks like the suspected gunman who has been charged, given the evidence that I've reviewed, I've seen reported, it's an extraordinarily strong case. He is very likely to be held accountable, whether via a guilty plea or at a trial. But there are all of these collateral consequences that, frankly, I have never seen before. And the one that I want to talk to you about is there's brand new reporting. I just read a CBS News article, and you were extensively quoted in that article concerning how military leadership is now scrutinizing social media posts of military members to see what they may have said about the Charlie Kirk murder. And military members are actually now being sanctioned for things that they said that, as you and I were discussing before we hopped on this recording, seem, benign to put it mildly. But maybe we can start with the basics and explain to the viewers, do military members have kind of the full First Amendment free speech rights that we all have, or are there some unique limitations because of their status as military members?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it involves a topic that many don't understand. Even those in the military don't fully appreciate the nuances here. And I'll just say that both you and I grew up in a military that didn't have to worry about social media. It wasn't something I had to worry about at all until I was probably a field grade officer, a junior major. Before that, they're just the worst that you could possibly do was walk out on the street wearing a sign that was disparaging to the president, right? Or write an op-ed. Now anybody and everybody has social media accounts, and it's so easy to spread a message worldwide instantly, and not fully appreciate the consequences of that message being spread or being misinterpreted. So the first thing to say is, yes, service members have a First Amendment speech protection, however, it is limited. It is constrained in a way, and that is because, and the Supreme Court has long recognized this, is that there are certain things that, if said by military service members, would have a deleterious effect, a damaging negative effect on good order and discipline within the ranks, and the ability of the commanders and the chain of command to actually execute lawful missions. So there was a seminal case in the mid-1970s involving an Army doctor this white Army doctor, was a podiatrist, I think, and he was working at a clinic at this Army base, and he would routinely tell African American service members that he saw that they shouldn't be deploying to go to Vietnam. He accused the special forces of being baby killers and rapists, and he said, to these African American service members, why are you willing to fight for a country that disrespects you and is racist against you? And that came to the attention of the chain of command, and they charged him with basically using these words, right, his speech, in a way that was prejudicial to good order and discipline, and had other negative effects for the Army. And he was prosecuted, he was convicted, he was sentenced, and he appealed, and it went all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court upheld his convictions. He argued that those convictions under the UCMJ violated his First Amendment rights, and they disagreed. They said, yeah, sure, if you're a podiatrist in Burbank, California, or Terre Haute, Indiana, or Columbus, Ohio, and you're a civilian and you say these things, yeah, you can't be prosecuted for that. Of course not. But you're not one of those things. You're an Army officer. And your responsibility as an Army officer is to obey lawful commands. And whether you agree with them or not, whether you find them morally repugnant or not, whether you find them to be contrary to your conscience or not, you have a duty, a lawful duty, to obey them. And you can't go around telling other soldiers to not obey them. That's seditious, essentially. That's mutinous in a way. And you can't foment that kind of disrespect for the chain of command and the mission. So the court upheld that conviction using the UCMJ provisions, basically target speech. We have regulations that talk about, no pun intended, talk about how a soldier or service member, sailor, marine, airman, guardian, whatever, are able to publicly talk in their private capacity as a citizen. You can write op-eds, you can go on TV, you can write a journal article, you can write a blog, and you can talk about things that are even controversial. But the regulations say that you have to disclaim your affiliation with the military. You have to say, this is my private capacity. This is not me speaking for the Army or the Navy or the Marine Corps or the DoD writ large. This is my personal opinion. So that's one kind of allowance that you have. You can do that. But there are specific articles in the UCMJ that are more specific about what you can't say. So there's an article called Contempt Toward Officials, Article 88 of the UCMJ, that only prohibits officers. It doesn't apply to enlisted service members, but only for officers can't use contemptuous speech, whether it's words spoken or words written, against the president, the vice president, the Secretary of Defense, Secretary of Homeland Security, the secretaries of the services, Congress as a whole, not individual members, but Congress as a whole, the legislature or the governor of the state that service member happens to be in at the time. Those are the potential victims of that contemptuous speech. You can't say contemptuous things about those people. The problem is contemptuous words are not defined, right? It's kind of in the ear of the victim, and it's not real clear exactly where that line is. It usually means something like, at least in the very small cases that have actually been prosecuted under this historically, it's things that are clearly contemptuous in the common meaning of the word, right? Using curse words to describe the president publicly, like in a protest, that would be considered contemptuous. Complaining or criticizing or having an argument about policy is not contemptuous. Getting into a debate about a contentious social issue is not contemptuous, even if your view happens to be contrary to the political power narrative that happens to be in the air. And that's kind of where we are right now. So you have the social media explosion after the Kirk assassination or murder, where millions of people are commenting about what's going on. And some have, benign things to say about the event. They just lament the fact that someone died, the fact that we have turned to this degree of violence in our society to solve problems and disagreements, and lamenting that. Others are very pro-Kirk and pro-Civil War, and others are, hey, he got what he deserved, or isn't it ironic that someone who said political violence is acceptable and gun deaths are acceptable to preserve the Second Amendment, isn't it ironic that he then gets killed by gun violence? Lots of people have these arguments and posts online in their private capacity. Now, because it was so quick and so widespread, it became a public issue. Everyone's talking about how public it is. And the eyes of certain, let's say, external agents to the DoD, people who are extraordinarily powerful influencers within the government. They're outside the government, but they're influencing people inside the government who have long turned their eyes skeptically on members of the military who might, quote unquote, be leftist or liberal or woke or whatever word you want to use to describe it, and then brought those names to the attention of the senior leadership for DEI, quote unquote, violations, that sort of thing, really since January. Now they've turned their attention to service members who are commenting at all about the Kirk incident. And there have been investigations now launched, formal investigations using normal administrative and criminal investigative procedures within the military to look at online statements made by service members in their private capacity. There are regulations about social media postings that have been out for a few years now, and those generally say things like you can't harass people and you can't incite violence, things that we would expect, right, to be regulated and off limit. You can be angry, you can be upset, you can be emotional, but don't incite violence and don't harass people. Don't share sensitive information, right? Don't disclose classified information. Those kinds of basic understandable restrictions are in the regulations. They don't say anything about having an opinion about a widespread social issue like gun violence or political violence more generally. They just don't, nor should they. It's entirely reasonable to have an opinion about that. Certainly for someone who's trained to use force in the name of the state, to have an opinion about gun violence outside of the government, I think is a rational voice to be heard about the issue. So you have these individuals, some of them are officers, some of them are senior ranking officers, not at the general officer level yet, as far as I know, but senior, like field grade majors, lieutenant colonels, and colonels are now being investigated for things that they said. And one example is an actual JAG, a current active duty JAG leader. She's the senior JAG at Fort Campbell for the storied 101st Airborne Division. She's a rising star. And she made a comment on her personal Facebook account, kind of decrying the state of debate in the country, the state of argument in the country, the fact that we're so violent in the country, and questioning where was the indignation about the school shootings and about the killing of the Minnesota lawmaker and her husband. Kind of hinting that there's a hypocrisy, but never mentioning Trump, never mentioning the Secretary of Defense, never mentioning MAGA, never mentioning even Kirk's name. And then she said, I'm leaving Facebook for a while because it's just too angry. That was her message. And that message was copied and pasted and shared with the people who are essentially these external agents for the government, who are, I have no better word for it than thought police, who are taking this and using it as an example of someone who shouldn't be leading troops, who shouldn't be allowed to serve their country. This is a person who has served honorably for her country for more than 20 years. She is married to a veteran, a wounded veteran. They have children. Collectively, they've served 50 years of time in defense of their country, putting their lives at risk multiple times. And she comments about the state of social discussion about a controversial subject, and now her career is at risk. And that is just incredibly sad to me, and it makes me very angry that we've gotten to the point where that is even remotely a discussion point. It shouldn't have been, never been. So that's where we are.
And it feels like this administration would be happy to use social media posts that are benign as a pretext to do what? Dislodge allegedly woke military leaders, which, we've seen how they have gotten rid of some of the judge advocate generals over some of the services. And I've talked about that in the past. I'm sure you have. I've always tried to reassure people that, at least given my 6.5 years of active duty as an Army JAG officer, I know you were an Army JAG officer much longer, an entire career. I said, I really don't think they're going to be able to fire their way through ethical JAG leadership. I mean, we are taught a number of things, both in officer basic training and at the JAG school. Things like, the responsibility we have to obey lawful orders, but the obligation to disobey patently unlawful orders. And I think that is part of the DNA of folks who serve across all of the military services as JAG officers.